Hey, Brad, 52 days away from college football. I feel like we've turned the corner after the July the 4th holiday.
Yeah, I didn't realize it was that many. It feels like we should be closer than 52, not only because we're just such a short time away from media days, but also because the season's starting a week earlier. I mean, we got Miami and Florida on August 24th. It's worth getting excited about.
Sure. No, 100%. I'm gonna ask you in a couple of minutes kind of what you look at in the SEC West, what you look at in the SEC East. But when we look at these different quarterbacks, we were going through a couple of minutes ago and looking at the SEC. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 quarterbacks out of 14 schools will be bringing a quarterback. Auburn's not going to bring one because they don't know who it is right now. There's a couple of other schools out there. Vanderbilt's not going to take one, but Tua Tagovailoa, Felipe Franks, Jake Fromm, Joe Burrow, Matt Corral out of Ole Miss, Kelly Bryant, Jake Bentley, Kellen Mond, and Jarrett Garantano from Tennessee. Little quarterback. I mean, that's a pretty good list of quarterbacks right there in the SEC.
Yeah, I got some good quarterbacks, and some of those guys, most of them, are guys who've already proven to be really good, and I think that's pretty exciting for the conference. I mean, look, Kellen Mond is a guy who I think has a lot of potential, and for him to have done what he's done so far, to be coming back basically for a third year as a starter, and to be in a conference where, I mean, he pretty much gets zero consideration for either first or second team preseason All SEC. That tells you a lot about the depth at quarterback in the league.
No, 100%. I mean, you think about it, and a lot of people look at Jake Fromm, and you begin to kind of look at him, and I know the game manager is tabbed on him, but he's a guy that is proven that he's more than just a game manager. He's made some big-time plays. Yeah, look, all you have to do is watch the SEC championship game. And, I mean, look, and some people might say, well, that was one of the best games he ever played. I don't know whether that's necessarily true. I know if you watch the Sugar Bowl, you didn't get a good representation of what he's capable of doing. But for the first 2.5 quarters of the SEC championship game, I mean, he was making NFL throws. I mean, guys who in some of those cases were barely open. I mean, open by NFL standards. I mean, some of the throws he was making were in the only spot where they could have been thrown. And I know at one point, I think he was like 8 of 10, 9 of 11, and the only 2 incompletions were balls that were dropped. So Fromm has shown that, he can throw with the best of them when he's on his game. And so it's just a question of, is the running game there to go with it? And, for most of the last 2 years, it has been at Georgia, and I don't think there's any reason to believe that the running game, won't be there again this year for the Dogs. We're talking to Brad Edwards, ESPN college football analyst, ESPN.com, ESPN radio that you hear here on Tide 102.9 in Tuscaloosa. Brad, I want to go into the conversation when you begin to look at Dylan Moses. Nick Saban sort of put some responsibility on him. He's going to send him to represent the defensive side of the football. Alabama, and this maybe a first. I'd have to go back and really look at it, but he's going to carry 2 offensive players, Tua and Jerry Jeudy, from that side of the football. He's looking at Dylan Moses and saying, hey, we want you to be that leader on that side of the football. Alabama needs the alpha dog. When you look at Dylan Moses, can he be Alabama's typical linebacker that they've been at? Last year I didn't think they had one. Maybe Dylan Moses takes that next step.
Yeah, I agree with you. That was kind of missing last year, but going back for 10 or 11 years, that guy's always been there. And it's just every time that they lose Rolando McClain, and then there's Hightower, and then Hightower's gone, and I actually can't even remember the order of them, whether it was Mosley who was next, and Ragland, and and it's just one after the other, and there's always someone who's there, and it's not just that the guy has a good understanding of the defense and is good at getting everyone in position, but a guy who has just really good instincts and a nose for the ball, and Alabama has almost always had that guy in the middle of the field, and that was missing last year. I mean, Dylan Moses obviously is a guy who, I mean, even since he was in, 8th grade?
Eighth grade, he got an offer from Alabama, Nick Saban.
Yeah, I mean, people have been hyping him,
ever since that point. So there's never been a question about the talent. But I know that Saban has said this a couple of times before when he's been up here in Bristol, and I can only assume that he's said it many times in Alabama as well, is that he doesn't worry so much about a number of returning starters, or I should say a loss of starters, as much as he worries about a loss of leadership. And I think that's a big thing with him is leadership. Who are the guys who are going to step up and be the new leaders when the ones from the previous year departed? And maybe that's something that was missing a little bit, last year with Alabama on defense. I mean, you look at the guys who were really the most productive out there on the field. I'm not sure how much of that leadership came from those guys. And so if he has confidence in Dylan Moses, then I would say that's a good sign, because I don't think there's any question the guy's got talent. But does he have the other intangible that's so important to Saban?
Brad, let's go to the SEC, and I want to spend some time in the SEC West. I don't know if it's a fair assumption, but we've been talking about Alabama and Clemson for probably 6 months. In the SEC West, I assume that you've got Alabama at number one. You think Alabama's going to win the division?
Yeah. I mean, to me, the big question is number two, and I lean toward LSU. I think I like LSU in every game other than the trip to Tuscaloosa. And if they were able to win all of the other games, even if they lose to Alabama, I still think that puts you in a good position to make the playoff. It obviously depends on what happens in other conferences and who you're going up against if you don't have a conference championship. But if you're 11-1 and your only loss to Alabama and Tuscaloosa, assuming it's a relatively competitive game, then I think LSU would still have a chance to get into the playoff. And I think they're a team that has enough talent to do it. And I think what often gets overlooked with them, or at least coming into this year, I would say, is quarterback play, because it's almost become like the running joke in the SEC that LSU just doesn't have good enough quarterback play, even though they obviously have NFL talent or close to it at every other position on the field, and it's always the quarterback that's the difference in them not being elite. And I think that if you look at Joe Burrow and what he did last year, and take a step back and remember that at this time last year, he was just arriving on campus, transferring from Ohio State, didn't have the benefit of going through spring practice. So he's having to learn a whole new playbook, gain familiarity with his teammates. There was a lot that he had to kind of digest as he first came on. And so we shouldn't have expected anything other than a slow start. But after the Alabama game, he really started to come on. I thought he did a really good job last year. I know our metric, total QBR, likes him a whole lot more than the NCAA pass efficiency formula does. And I think he's a good quarterback. And to me, the main question is, can he make enough big plays against the best defenses they're going to face? And I think that's really what it comes down to, as to whether LSU is a team that can win 11 games is, will Joe Burrow step up big enough in their biggest games? But I don't think there's any question that he's good enough to get them to at least 10 wins. I
would assume Texas A&M is in that third spot. I won't run through all seven over here on this division, but just kind of looking at number three.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the problem with A&M is the schedule.
Oh, it's nasty.
Yeah, and look, I realize there are other teams in the SEC that have brutal schedules as well. I mean, Auburn's schedule is pretty tough too. So I don't want to act like theirs is a lot easier than A&M's. But I wouldn't write Auburn off either as far as that number three spot. We know what their pattern is, which is that when people aren't talking about them a whole lot preseason is when they tend to play their best. They also tend to play their best when they have experience coming back on the offensive line. And I think they have that. And so Auburn is a team that, even though there is a major question at quarterback, and you would expect that, that they might struggle a little bit there in the first month of the season, I think by the time they hit the meat of conference play, they're going to, get settled at quarterback. And I'd give Auburn a, pretty good chance to finish in that number three spot in the West.
Let's go to the SEC East. Are you buying Florida? Do you believe that they can really push Georgia? It seems like Georgia seems to be the lock, but everybody seems to be buying the Gators, that they can give them a little bit of a game at the largest outdoor cocktail party there in Jacksonville.
Yeah, the question for me with Florida is going to be their offensive line. It's probably fair to have some other questions about them too. But that's an area where they've been really weak for a number of years, and they actually were I think above average there last year, but they lost some key players, and that's the question for me. Are they going to be good enough there to not lose a game that they shouldn't lose? Because that's the first step. The first step to having a chance to win the East is that you've got to do well enough in the other games that if you can beat Georgia, and I wouldn't say that's a huge upset, it would be an upset, but maybe not a huge one, that if you win the Georgia game, that you can win the division by just not losing more than one of the other games. That's the thing. It's like, do I trust Florida that even if they beat Georgia, that they're not going to lose, two other games in conference play? And at the moment, I'm not sure that I do have that level of trust. Felipe Franks, he was much better toward the end of last season, and I think Florida fans are rightfully excited about what he might be able to do. But, option for me, and I still think that there is a noticeable gap in talent between Georgia and Florida. In fact, I don't know, it was about 2 months ago, I was hosting Feinbaum and had on who covers Florida, and he said to me, and I don't know which recruiting service he was referencing, but I believe that what he said was that Florida does not have a single 5-star on its roster.
Wow.
Or maybe it was the roster that went through spring practice or whatever it was, And when you consider like the number of those guys at Georgia, and I realize, every 5-star doesn't turn out to play like a 5-star in college, and there are a lot of 3 and 4 stars who do. So that's that in itself doesn't determine how good of a team is or how good a team is. But that's just we're not that far removed from Urban Meyer at Florida dominating and recruiting, and to think that they've fallen off to a point where they wouldn't have a single 5-star. Like I said, that's probably not true with every recruiting service, but that one kind of caught me off guard when it was thrown out there. And I think what it says is they still have probably another recruiting class or two to go to close that ground on Georgia.
Let's go to Oklahoma just for a couple of minutes. I would like to ask you about the Big 12, 77 media members, and next week I'm kind of curious about all this positioning for the attention. Now, what the SEC's always done, and they're not going to be able to do that this time, is what they've always done is they've had the media days this week, and then they go to Bristol next week at the ESPN car wash, and they get the attention because everybody's getting the national publicity. It looks like next week is going to be the majority of media days. However, the Big 12 has chose to invite their media members to vote. It was released this afternoon. Everybody's buying Jalen Hurts in Oklahoma. They've got about 68 of the 77 people that voted in this media poll believe that Oklahoma is going to win the Big 12. How close is Texas there?
Yeah, I'm not huge on Texas this year. I would guess that most of the people in the media, especially nationally, are a little bit bigger on Texas than I am. I think the line of scrimmage is so important, and people overlook that. And Texas lost, especially defensively, some really good players up front. I think they're going to have a difficult time replacing. It's not like they're replacing them with a bunch of chumps. It is Texas, and they do recruit well. But I think overall their number of returning starters is like 8. They're one of the lower numbers in all of the FBS as far as returning starters. And it's not like they have, Alabama level recruiting classes going back 4 or 5 years in order to just restock the shelves with, a bunch of guys who seem to be, destined to be all conference or all American. And so I'm just not real sure about that. I think for Texas, a key game, even though it's out of conference, is week 2 when LSU comes in there. If they lose that, they're going to, after all the preseason hype they're going to get, they're going to be in a position with an early loss where they're going to have to run the table through the Big 12. And that would include more than likely having to beat Oklahoma twice, once in the regular season, once in the conference championship game. And I don't think they're in a position yet where they can do that. I'm also not even confident enough that I trust Texas to go on the road and beat Baylor and Iowa State. Off the top of my head, I believe they play both of those games on the road. And I think Baylor and Iowa State are the next two best teams in that conference. And so I kind of see Texas as a 9-3 type team, which is good. But I don't think they're quite at the level yet where where I would have confidence that they can go out and win that league.
So you think it's just Oklahoma just walks away with it?
My question is whether Oklahoma will be close to as good offensively as they have been. And that this is not a knock on Hurts. It's more recognition that Oklahoma's last two seasons, and obviously they had a Heisman-winning running back who was drafted first overall in both of those seasons. So, I mean, that's pretty historic in itself. But if you look at what those two offenses did on the field, they were historically good. I mean, there have not been many offenses, if any, in the history of college football as good as the last two Oklahoma offenses. And so they're destined to take a step back. Now, how much of a step back? The other question, obviously, that goes with that is, can their defense improve from being heinous to just, a little bad? Because if they're mediocre defensively, they'll be good enough with Hurts at quarterback to win almost every game they play. But that's the question. How much will they improve defensively? Because if they're still a sieve on that side of the ball and, teams in the Big 12 can score 40-something points on them, I don't think it's out of the question that they could lose. And I don't even think it's out of the question they could lose at UCLA, which I think is week 2. And so I think Oklahoma wins that conference. My question is, will they be able to do it without losing 2 games? And if that doesn't happen, then I think they could win the Big 12, and the Big 12 doesn't get a team in the playoff.
Wow. Brad Edwards, did you hit him straight on Monday?
You know what? I overall, I did not have a good round. I had an eagle, which was good, but outside of that, I wasn't real happy with the way.
Okay, who won, the Georgia or the Florida guy?
So they were both on my team. We were playing a scramble.
Okay.
And it's funny because the reason I say I made an eagle, even though it was a scramble, is because it was a short par 4, and I drove the green, and I intentionally said, look, I want to play the first shot, and I'm going to play my ball as it lies so that it's a legit eagle if I make it.
Okay.
And so those two were on my team, and it was just funny because all day long I'm driving in my golf cart behind a cart where you've got a Georgia head cover and a Florida head cover sitting right next to each other, and I'm thinking this is one of those things that you might see this every now and then, especially in the state of Alabama. You'll see the Auburn and the Alabama together and all that, but Georgia, Florida, maybe not quite as much just because they're two different states, but in Connecticut, you certainly don't expect to see that on a golf course. But that's I don't know. You would love to walk through the parking lot here at ESPN and just look at like license plate frames and stickers on the backs of cars, because they're just, I mean, you walk through there in about 5 minutes, you could probably find about 30 different FBS schools that are represented. Because they just got all these people from all over, and that makes it a really fun place to work.
I can imagine. I mean, I can imagine the cafeteria is probably a little bit of smack talk, a little bit, kind of put the media hat to the side a little bit and kind of have a little bit of fun. But J. Brad Edwards on ESPN Stats and Information Group, ESPN Radio, ESPN.com, college football analyst, Brad Edwards. Brad, as always, thank you so much for your time here in T-Town.
You got it, Ryan. Take care.